All right, everybody, welcome back. We're looking at evolution part one of our two parts of this unit. And just to start it off, we're going to be putting a few misconceptions to rest during this unit and focusing on the science and the evidence that we have. So if you look at this one here, this isn't always the best representation of what evolution is because it's not a direct flow from one organism necessarily to the next. It's usually going to be branching and coming from a common ancestor. Okay, so let's get right into it here. What we know. So first of all, we have the theory of evolution. We're going to be going over that in a few minutes. And then we also have a few agents, a few things that can cause some evolutionary change. And these are the five that we're going to be focusing on in this unit. So you can pause those and get it down. All right, so let's start with the theory of evolution. We have the first component of the evolution is that over time, life on Earth has changed. It doesn't stay the same due to various environmental pressures. Things are caused, or environment causes them either to change and adapt or die out or move away, really. We have the descent with modification, which means parents pass on genes to their offspring. However, since there's going to be two parents, they're going to be modified because they blend together when they get passed on to their offspring. And then finally, that they come from ancient ancestors. So the organisms don't just appear, they have come from a common descendant and have adapted throughout the years. Okay, so pause that and get it down. Okay, so a little bit of background here. In order for us to know about evolution, we have to remember back to our DNA unit, and we remember that DNA is going to be coiled into chromosome shapes when it's ready to divide. Those genes that are on the DNA, more specifically on the chromosome, those genes are the specific code to produce a specific protein. So as you remember from the DNA unit, a gene expresses the order of the amino acids that they need in order to make a protein. Each of those genes, we have a couple we have two copies of each genes because we're diploid organisms. So even though you have the same gene, for example, eye color, you have different types of those genes, which would be called alleles. So that's what actually is expressed. So even though you might have, the same genes for eye color as somebody else, they're expressing blue eyes where you express brown eyes. Okay, so you can jot that down now. So what happens in order for those genes to change is that there's usually some sort of mutation. So an error when we are going to be replicating, or sometimes when we're going to be transcribing our DNA into RNA. And if there's a change in the DNA, it changes the order of the amino acids. And for example, so the mutation in the hair color can change the DNA from this into this. And it all depends on if that's favorable. If you're an organism that normally lives in the snow and you're like this in the winter, that is not going to be favorable. If you have a mutation where you were like this in the winter and now you are like this is a favorable trait and it will be carried on and passed along to the next generation. So the next topic we're going to talk about is allopatric speciation. We consider in class, we'll just basically refer to it as speciation. And this just means creating a new species. And the reason why this happens is when organisms are separated from each other, they're no longer trading their genetic information and changes occur. They don't breed anymore, and over a long period of time, it can lead to incompatible DNA. So they're not able to reproduce viable offspring. So like I mentioned, this prevents genetic material from exchanging, and it's due to being subjected to different environmental pressures. And then different species cannot produce fertile offspring. So that's the key thing. We might wonder why one, like a lion, is different than a tiger in terms of its species. Well, they cannot produce fertile offspring. They can produce offspring, if you've seen the liger, but they're not going to be having other ligers from them. Okay, so pause that. So here's just an example. We have a common ancestor here. And what happens is they get geographically isolated. There's mutations that occur. And what you see over time is that the differences between them. So again, they were one common ancestor. Differences have come up. And since they're no longer able to intermate, those differences are a lot more drastic because there's no sharing of those genetic information. Okay, so gene flow is one that tricks people a little bit. Sometimes they get confused with this and the next one. And what this means is the transfer of the alleles or genes from one population to another. So where there is a population of a certain allele in one area, it's going to take that allele and take it into an area where that allele did not exist before. And so what this does is it changes the proportion of a specific type of an allele. And it can cause a population to change, but what it does is as long as that gene is continuing to flow back and forth, it does not turn into a new species. So if you can picture this blue bird going over here and intermating with the red bird, as long as they're going back and forth, it's not going to be a new species because they're still going to be compatible. If this goes over here and introduces this blue one into the red species, and they no longer go back and there's a separation here, then that could lead to a new species due to this physical barrier. We call it reproductive isolation. Okay, so you can pause that and get it down. So genetic drift is one that people get mixed up from the gene flow. This one is random. That is the key here. So it's the random sampling, and more importantly, it's the change in the frequency of the allele in that population due to random sampling. So this is a good example of what happens. So you can see it starts off 50-50, and then depending on what we're picking out and putting into the next generation will impact what's going to be in the third one. So again, this is just due to random sampling. So it starts 50-50, and then as you can see here, after a few generations, it's no longer 50-50. The key here, as you're going to see from other evolutionary agents, is that this is random. And we'll give you some good examples of this in class. And sadness. No more red. Okay, non-random mating should be fairly simple for most people. It means that organisms are going to choose a mate for reasons that are not random. Okay, so here's an example. The American red robin has a red chest. If they have a darker plumage or darker red, that usually indicates reproductive performance, and they are going to be more heavily favored than organisms that do not have the red chest. So what are you going to see in the next generation? More and darker red chests than not. Okay, so you can pause that down and get it done. And this is the one that people are most common with, the natural selection. This is where traits become more or less common based on the fitness of an organism. What does fitness mean? The most favorable organism is going to be able to survive and reproduce. Okay, so you're not fit just because you have muscles. It depends on the organism which makes you more fit. But either way, if you survive better and reproduce more favorably, you are going to be able to pass your genetics on to the next level. So it doesn't matter if you're really good at surviving if you can't reproduce. It doesn't matter if you can reproduce really well if you never live. Okay. So here's a good example is the pepper moth. In this scenario, this black one's really successful. Well, in this one, the black and white one's going to be really successful. So it all depends on the environment on who's going to be the most fit. Okay, pause that. I'll let you laugh or not. Okay, finishing it off here, adaptation. So in order for an organism to evolve, they need to have some sort of adaptation. So it's genetically controlled, so through your DNA, that is going to increase the fitness of an organism. So if they're better able to survive and reproduce, it's due to an adaptation. Adaptation, as I mentioned, doesn't involve trying. This is a random act. It's not like this because he wants to become better at chopping down trees. He is not going to be able to. And that is it. So we will be going over this all again in class. And if you have questions, jot them down and we'll take them up.